a scruffy dog, a crumpled note, and a life-changing discovery. Sergeant David Carter never expected his life to change on that cold autumn night. Exhausted after a grueling shift, all he wanted was to go home and collapse onto his couch. But fate had other plans. A small, scruffy dog appeared following him through the empty streets, its ribs showing, its eyes pleading. It wasn't just lost, it had a purpose. And when David knelt down, brushing the dirt-streaked fur aside to check its worn collar, he found it a crumpled note. 4 words, scribbled in shaky, desperate handwriting. "Help, my brother is sick." In that moment, everything changed. What he found at the other end of that note would haunt him forever: a starving 8-year-old boy, clinging to his fever-ridden baby brother, abandoned in a dark, empty apartment, no food, no water, no one coming back for them. David had spent his career saving strangers. But this time, he couldn't walk away. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. And if you love stories of courage, resilience, and the power of family, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's begin. Sergeant David Carter pulled his jacket tighter against the biting autumn wind. The street was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of dry leaves skittering along the cracked pavement. The dim glow of streetlights stretched long shadows across the sidewalk as he trudged home after a grueling 12-hour shift. His body ached, his mind weighed down by the countless cases he had handled that day. But all he could think about was a hot shower and the comfort of his worn-out recliner. Then, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping against the pavement. At first, he ignored it, just another stray sound in the city's endless hum. But when he stopped at the corner, waiting for the pedestrian signal to change, the sound ceased as well. He turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder. A small, scruffy dog stood a few feet away, its thin body barely visible in the flickering glow of the street lamp. David frowned. The pup was filthy, its brown fur matted with dirt, ribs visible beneath the unkempt coat. One ear stood up while the other flopped over, giving it a lopsided, almost comical appearance. Yet, there was nothing amusing about the way it looked at him, those deep, dark eyes filled with something more than just hunger. "Go on, get home," David muttered, waving a dismissive hand. The dog tilted its head, but didn't move. David sighed. It was late. He didn't have time for this. He crossed the street, shoving his hands into his pockets. But after a few steps, he heard it again, the soft, persistent pattering of tiny paws behind him. He stopped. The dog stopped. He took another step. So did the dog. David turned fully this time, exasperated. "Look, buddy, I can't help you," he said, more firmly now. "I don't even have pets in my building." Still, the dog didn't leave. Instead, it took a hesitant step closer, tail wagging slightly but still low, as if unsure whether to trust him or not. David groaned, running a hand down his face. "Fine," he muttered, crouching down. "Come here." The dog flinched but didn't back away. It was trembling now that he was closer, its thin body barely able to stand against the cold night air. That's when David noticed the worn leather collar hanging loosely around its neck. Not a stray. Then, someone's dog. He reached out slowly, trying not to startle the little creature. When his fingers brushed against the collar, he felt something tucked inside the worn leather was a small, crumpled piece of paper. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he eased the paper out, smoothing it against his palm under the dim glow of the streetlight. The writing was uneven, the ink smudged in places, as if written by an unsteady hand or by someone very young. "Help, my brother is sick. No food, no water. Apartment 3B. David's breath hitched. His exhaustion vanished in an instant, replaced by a sharp, electric sense of urgency. His eyes flicked back to the dog, who was now staring at him intently, as if waiting for him to understand. And suddenly, he did. This little dog wasn't just lost, it was leading him somewhere. Without another thought, David stuffed the note into his pocket and straightened up. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice now steady with purpose. "Show me the way." The dog gave a small, eager bark and took off down the street, its tiny paws tapping against the pavement with renewed energy. David ran after it, his heart pounding not just from the sprint, but from the terrifying thought that with every second wasted, some child was waiting in the darkness, hoping that help was coming, and he would not let them down. David's boots pounded against the pavement as he followed the small dog through the empty streets. The pup was fast, darting through alleys and weaving around lampposts. Its tiny body fueled by a determination that David could feel in his own chest. This wasn't just a random stray. It had a mission. And so did he. The streets grew darker as they entered a rundown neighborhood. The air smelled of damp concrete and garbage left too long in the cold. Most of the buildings here were relics of better days, windows patched with cardboard. Neon signs flickering over vacant storefronts. Then, the dog abruptly turned and sprinted toward a towering apartment complex. David skidded to a stop in front of it, his breath fogging in the night air. The building was a relic of the past, paint peeling off in jagged strips. Balconies sagging under the weight of rust and neglect. A broken security door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly with the wind. No wonder no one had called for help. No one cared what happened in places like this. The dog bounded through the entrance, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway beyond. David followed, his instincts already on high alert. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting sickly yellow hues over the grimy linoleum floor. The hallway smelled of mildew, cigarette smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic and sour. He barely had time to process the state of the building before the dog stopped in front of a door marked 3B. David hesitated only for a moment before rapping his knuckles against the wood. "Police? Anyone inside?" Silence. The dog whined and scratched frantically at the bottom of the door. David knocked again, harder this time. "It's the police. Open up." Nothing. His gut twisted. This wasn't the silence of someone asleep or unwilling to answer. It was the kind of silence that meant something was very, very wrong. He reached for the doorknob. Locked. David took a step back, exhaling sharply, his body tensed, every nerve in his system screaming at him that there was no time to waste. With one swift motion, he planted his foot next to the lock and kicked. Crack. The door flew open, slamming into the wall. And then, the smell hit him. A thick, suffocating stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else he couldn't quite place, a scent that sent every instinct in his body into overdrive. He stepped inside. The apartment was dark. The only source of light came from the hallway behind him, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, he saw them. A boy, no older than 8, sat curled against the peeling wallpaper, his thin arms wrapped tightly around a baby. David froze. The boy's eyes were wide, hollow pools of fear and exhaustion. His face gaunt from malnutrition. His lips were cracked, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame as if they belonged to someone twice his size. The baby barely a year old, if that was unnaturally still. Its tiny chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, its flushed skin a telltale sign of fever. Jesus. David swallowed hard, forcing himself to push past the horror clawing at his throat. He took a slow step forward. "Hey, kid," he said softly, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "I'm Sergeant Carter. I'm here to help." The boy flinched violently, pressing himself further into the corner. His grip on the baby tightened, as if he thought David was there to take rather than to save. The dog, his unexpected little partner in this, trotted forward, tail wagging hesitantly. It nuzzled against the boy's thin arm, licking at the dirt on his skin. The boy trembled, but he didn't push the dog away. David slowly knelt down, careful not to make any sudden movements. "It's okay," he murmured. "I promise. I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't answer. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a way out, a reason not to believe David. David's gaze flicked over the apartment. The kitchen cabinets stood open, their shelves empty. A single, rotting carton of milk lay tipped over in the fridge, its smell lingering in the stale air. A mattress sat bare in the corner, its stuffing spilling out from a gaping tear. The crib nearby was covered in soiled sheets, a few empty bottles scattered at its base. And on the kitchen counter, among the trash and old dishes, David saw a crumpled note. He reached for it, smoothing it out with his fingertips. "We can't do this anymore. No money, no jobs. We'll find help and come back. Just take care of your brother. Be strong." A slow, seething rage built in David's chest as he clenched the paper in his fist. They weren't coming back. They had abandoned these kids. And now, The older brother, this child had been left to carry the weight of a responsibility that no 8-year-old should ever bear. David exhaled sharply and shoved the note into his pocket. He had seen enough. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is Sergeant Carter. I need emergency medical assistance at 145 Ridgeway. Apartment 3B. 2 minors. Severe malnutrition and dehydration. 1 infant in critical condition." As he spoke, the boy's small hand shot out, gripping the sleeve of his jacket. David looked down. The boy's fingers were curled so tightly into the fabric that his knuckles had gone white. His entire body was trembling, his breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. David gently placed his own hand over the boy's. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Help is coming." The boy's lips parted slightly, his voice so soft David barely heard him. "Don't leave." David felt something tighten deep in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was anger, grief, or something else entirely, but when he spoke again, his voice was steady. "I won't," he promised. "I swear to you, I won't." Outside, in the distance, sirens began to wail, and David knew this was only the beginning. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing through the crumbling walls of the apartment. David stayed crouched beside the boy, his presence steady, unwavering. The child's small fingers were still curled into the sleeve of his jacket, his grip weak yet desperate, like a drowning person clinging to the last piece of driftwood. The baby in his arms let out a weak whimper, barely a sound, but enough to send a fresh wave of urgency through David's chest. He turned toward the doorway just as the paramedics arrived, their equipment rattling as they rushed inside. The fluorescent hallway lights cast their faces in sharp relief, expressions of practiced urgency mixed with the immediate horror of the scene before them. "Jesus," one of them muttered under his breath before quickly snapping into action. David gently pried the boy's fingers from his sleeve. "They're here to help your brother. Okay?" But the boy didn't move. His body remained tense, rigid, eyes locked onto the baby in his arms as if letting go would mean losing him forever. David softened his tone. "I need you to trust me." The boy hesitated. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he slowly, painfully loosened his hold on the baby. A paramedic took the infant carefully, laying him on a portable stretcher. The baby's skin looked far too pale under the harsh emergency lights, his small body fragile against the sterile white of the sheets. The lead paramedic called out rapid assessments. "Severe dehydration, malnourishment, fevers running high. We need an IV now." David turned back to the boy, who had curled in on himself, his arms wrapped tightly around his thin body. The dog, his tiny protector, pressed against him, whining softly, licking at the boy's dirt-streaked hand. "Hey, buddy," David said gently. "We need to go with them. All right? They're going to take care of your brother." The boy shook his head. "No," he whispered, voice hoarse, raw. "I can't. I have to stay with him." David's chest tightened. He recognized this. This wasn't just fear, this was trauma. This was a child who had already been abandoned, who had already learned the painful lesson that people leave, and the only thing he could do to protect what little he had left was to hold on as tight as possible. David wouldn't let that happen again. "Then come with him," he said, his voice steady. "I won't leave him, and I won't leave you. I promise." The boy's eyes flickered with uncertainty, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, hesitantly, he reached out. David took his small, cold hand in his own. "Let's go." The ride to the hospital. Inside the ambulance, the baby lay motionless on the stretcher, an oxygen mask carefully placed over his tiny face. The paramedics worked in a quiet, urgent rhythm, checking vitals, administering fluids, monitoring his every breath. David sat on the bench beside the boy, who was still gripping his hand, his knuckles white. The dog now curled in David's lap, pressed against the child's side, its small body a living anchor keeping him grounded. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors filled the air, a metronome of fragile life hanging by a thread. David could feel the boy's tension, the way his body shook with exhaustion but refused to give in. "What's your name, kid?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, so softly David almost missed it. "Ethan." David nodded, letting the name settle between them like a fragile bridge. "Ethan, that's a strong name." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on his brother, watching every tiny movement, every shuddering breath. "Then, is he going to die?" The question was barely a whisper. David tightened his grip on Ethan's hand. Not if I can help it. Ethan swallowed hard. Then for the first time since they'd met, his body sagged slightly. Just enough for David to feel the weight of his exhaustion. But he didn't let go. Not once. The hospital. The was a blur of motion and noise. The moment the ambulance doors opened, nurses and doctors swarmed in, swiftly taking the baby from the paramedics. Ethan panicked. No, he choked out, trying to bolt after them. David caught him before he could run. Ethan, listen to me. He knelt in front of the boy, gripping his shoulders firmly but gently. They need space to help him. Okay? We'll stay right here. We won't leave. Ethan's breathing came in shallow gasps, his small chest rising and falling too fast. The dog, sensing his distress, pressed against his legs. Ethan didn't fight David's grip, but he didn't relax either. A nurse directed them to a quiet waiting room, where the fluorescent lights hummed against the stark white walls. The plastic chairs were uncomfortable, the air too cold. David sat beside Ethan, letting the boy clutch his sleeve once again. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, finally, a doctor emerged. Ethan sat up so fast he nearly fell off his chair. The doctor gave them a tired but reassuring nod. Your brother is stable. David felt Ethan's body sag beside him. He was severely dehydrated, but we've got him on fluids now. He's weak, but he's responding to treatment. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. Then very softly, very hesitantly, he whispered, "Thank you." David exhaled. "You don't have to thank me. Kid, I told you I'm not leaving." Ethan looked at him then. Really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to believe that or not. Then, slowly, he nodded. For the first time that night, the first time in what was probably a very long time, there was hope. But David knew this wasn't over yet. Not even close. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when David pulled into the driveway of his modest home. The night had been long, too long, and exhaustion pressed against his body like a heavy weight. But the moment he glanced in the rearview mirror, all thoughts of rest faded. In the backseat, Ethan sat rigid, his arms wrapped protectively around the infant car seat, cradling his baby brother. Lucas, his small hands gripped the straps tightly, as if he feared that at any moment, someone might come and rip the baby away. Beside him, the scruffy little dog whom Ethan had finally whispered was named Lucky was curled up on the seat, his dark eyes flicking between Ethan and David with an almost human-like understanding. David turned off the engine, but Ethan didn't move. "We're here," David said, keeping his voice steady. "Careful." Ethan's eyes darted to the house, his new house. David could see it in his face, the fear, the uncertainty. To Ethan, homes weren't safe places. Homes were temporary. Homes were where people left you. David unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, moving to open Ethan's door. "Come on, buddy, let's get Lucas inside." Ethan hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded, not because he trusted David, because he had no other choice. The house, the air inside was warm, carrying the faint scent of coffee and old books. It wasn't fancy, just a simple one-story home with faded blue paint and a well-worn couch in the living room. A dining table sat against the far wall, covered in unopened mail and half-drunk cups of coffee from rushed mornings. But unlike Ethan's old apartment, this place wasn't empty. It was lived in. David led them down the hallway to a small bedroom. The walls had been hastily repainted, the smell of fresh paint still lingering. A bunk bed sat against one wall, a soft nightlight plugged into the outlet beside it. David had spent the last few hours before picking them up trying to make it feel like a home. But he wasn't sure if Ethan even knew what that was supposed to feel like. "You can pick which bed you want," David said, setting down Lucas's carrier beside the crib he had hurriedly assembled the night before. "Top or bottom, up to you." Ethan didn't move. Instead, he looked around the room, his eyes scanning every corner, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Where were the exits? Was there food? How easy would it be to leave? Then, without a word, Ethan stepped past the bunk beds and, to David's quiet heartbreak, settled himself on the floor. Lucky trotted over and curled beside him, pressing his small body against Ethan's side. David let out a slow breath. "One step at a time." "All right," he said, keeping his tone light. "I'll be in the next room if you need anything." Ethan didn't respond. David turned off the light but left the nightlight glowing. As he pulled the door halfway closed, he saw something that made his throat tighten. Even as exhaustion dragged at his small frame, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay curled up, arms wrapped around himself, not trusting this place. Not trusting this man. Not trusting anything. David leaned against the hallway wall, running a tired hand down his face. How do you teach a child to feel safe when the world has already convinced him that safety is a lie? The first night, David was halfway asleep on the couch when he heard it. A sound, small, muffled, a whimper. His eyes snapped open. He listened. Then a sharp intake of breath. A quiet sob. David pushed himself up, careful not to startle. He followed the sound down the hallway, stopping just outside the partially open door of the boys' room. Inside, the dim glow of the nightlight revealed Ethan, still on the floor, his tiny frame shaking. Lucky was awake, pressed against the boy's side, licking his hand gently. David didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, lowering himself to sit beside Ethan on the floor. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but he didn't look at David either. For a long time, David didn't speak. Sometimes, silence was better than words. Finally, after what felt like forever, Ethan's voice came, so small, so fragile. Is she coming back? David knew exactly who he meant. He exhaled slowly. I don't think so, kid. Ethan's lip trembled, but he didn't cry. He just nodded, like he had already known the answer but needed someone else to say it out loud. Then softer, barely above a whisper. Are you going to leave too? David felt his chest tighten. He turned slightly, looking Ethan right in the eyes. No. Ethan didn't react, not at first, but then so small it was almost imperceptible his shoulders eased. Just the tiniest bit. A sliver of trust. A fragile beginning. David didn't push for more. Instead, he reached for the extra blanket folded at the end of the bed. Carefully, gently, he draped it over Ethan's small body. Ethan didn't push it away. Lucky let out a contented sigh and curled closer. And for the first time in who knew how long, Ethan slept. David stayed there, sitting on the floor beside him, listening to the slow, steady breaths of the boy and his tiny, loyal protector. This wasn't going to be easy. But nothing worth fighting for ever was. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft golden hues over the small table where David stood flipping pancakes. The warm scent of butter and syrup filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile rooms Ethan had likely known before. He glanced toward the hallway. It had been an hour since he started breakfast, but Ethan still hadn't come out of his room. David exhaled, flipping the last pancake onto a plate before walking toward the door. He knocked lightly. Breakfast is ready. No answer. He tried again. Ethan? Still nothing. David debated for a moment, then slowly pushed the door open. Inside, Ethan sat on the floor, exactly where he had fallen asleep the night before. The blanket David had given him was bunched up in his lap. Untouched, Lucky lay beside him, head resting on the boy's knee, eyes half closed in quiet loyalty. Ethan's arms were wrapped around himself, and David could tell he hadn't slept much. David hesitated before stepping inside, kneeling down a few feet away. He kept his voice light. You know, pancakes taste best when they're hot. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at the floor. Lucky licked his fingers, nudging at his hand as if urging him to say something. To react. Nothing. David sighed and shifted, sitting cross-legged. I'm not gonna make you eat if you don't want to. But I figured you might be hungry. Ethan's stomach betrayed him before he could respond. A loud, involuntary growl echoing in the small room. David pretended not to notice. Tell you what, he said casually. How about I leave the plate on the table? You can grab it whenever you want. Ethan hesitated. Then finally, reluctantly he nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. The first meal. David sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, waiting. He didn't watch the clock, didn't tap his fingers impatiently, he just waited. And then, almost an hour later, Ethan emerged from the hallway. He moved cautiously, as if expecting someone to stop him at any moment. Lucky trotted beside him, tail wagging slightly. Ethan stopped at the kitchen doorway, his gaze flickering from the food on the table to David, clearly expecting some kind of rule, some condition he would have to follow. David simply nodded toward the plate. Go ahead, kid, it's all yours. Ethan hesitated. Then, he moved forward, took the plate, And instead of sitting at the table, he went to the farthest corner of the kitchen. Back against the wall, plate in his lap, David's heart clenched. He was eating like a child who had learned that food could be taken away at any moment. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. He took a bite, a small one. Careful, like he was afraid of eating too fast. David didn't say anything. He didn't tell him to sit at the table. Didn't tell him not to eat on the floor. Because this wasn't about comfort, this was about survival. And right now, Ethan was still surviving. The dog and the boy. Later that afternoon, David stepped outside to grab the mail. When he returned, he found Ethan sitting in the living room, not on the couch, but on the floor beside Lucky. The dog was stretched out, his belly exposed in absolute trust. And for the first time, Ethan looked relaxed. David leaned against the doorframe. "You two seem like a good team." Ethan stiffened at the sound of his voice, his fingers pausing mid-stroke against Lucky's fur. David caught the tension immediately and softened his tone. "Did you always have him?" Ethan hesitated, then asterisk so quietly David almost missed it asterisk he shook his head. "He found me." David raised an eyebrow. "How'd that happen?" Ethan glanced down at Lucky, rubbing his ears with a quiet reverence. "He followed me home one night. I gave him some bread. After that, he never left." David let the words settle between them. Two strays, taking care of each other. Lucky wagged his tail, leaning into Ethan's touch. David watched as the boy's expression softened just a fraction, but it was there. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The nightmare. That night, David woke to the sound of muffled crying. It was faint, barely a whisper through the house, but he knew exactly where it was coming from. He pushed the blanket off and made his way down the hall, stopping just outside Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, in the dim glow of the nightlight, Ethan sat huddled in the corner of the room, knees pulled to his chest, shoulders shaking. Lucky was there, nudging him with his nose, whimpering softly. David's chest ached. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, he just stepped inside. He sat down beside Ethan, leaving space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "I dreamt they left me again." David swallowed hard. He didn't have to ask who they were. He exhaled slowly. "They're not coming back, Ethan." Ethan nodded, almost like he already knew. But that wasn't the real question. David knew what the real question was. "But are you?" Asterisk. The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit David like a punch to the gut. He turned, meeting Ethan's gaze in the dim light. "No, kid, I'm not." Ethan held his stare for a long moment. And then asterisk so small, so hesitant asterisk he shifted slightly. Just enough for his small shoulder to barely brush against David's arm. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. David didn't move, didn't say anything else. He just sat there, listening to Ethan's quiet breaths. Until asterisk for the first time in a long time asterisk the boy finally fell asleep. The morning after Ethan's nightmare, the house was quieter than usual. David moved through his routine, feeding Lucas, making coffee, letting Lucky out into the yard. But Ethan still hadn't come out of his room. He didn't push. He let the boy have space. He'd learned that forcing trust only made it crumble. But then, just as he was setting a plate of scrambled eggs on the table, he heard footsteps. Soft, hesitant. And there he was. Ethan stood in the hallway, arms wrapped tightly around himself, eyes flickering between David and the food like he was still deciding if this was real. David gave him a nod. "Morning, kid." Ethan hesitated. Then, without a word, he shuffled to the table. He didn't sit in a chair. He still chose the corner of the kitchen, his back to the wall. But he ate. David didn't comment on it, didn't try to move him. Because eating asterisk choosing to come out at all asterisk was already a victory. Lucky trotted over and settled at Ethan's side, curling up against his legs. The boy reached down absent-mindedly, fingers threading through the dog's fur as he chewed his food slowly. David sipped his coffee and let him eat in peace. The phone call. David was stacking dishes in the sink when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. Unknown number. A bad feeling settled in his chest. Carter. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a voice he hadn't heard before. Thin, unsteady. Is Ethan okay?" David's jaw clenched. He knew that voice. Ethan's mother. She was quiet for a moment, as if she didn't know how to continue. David could hear it in her breathing, the hesitation, the guilt, the way she probably had to work up the nerve just to call. I didn't mean to leave them for so long, she stammered, her voice cracking. Things just got so hard. I thought we'd come back sooner. But, she trailed off, like she couldn't even justify it to herself. David closed his eyes briefly, gripping the phone tighter. He could still see that filthy apartment, the empty cupboards, the feverish infant clinging to life. You abandoned them, he said, voice sharp and cold. You left an 8-year-old to care for a baby alone. No food, no water, and now you want to know if he's okay? There was a pause on the other end. Then a quiet sob. I just want to see them, she whispered. Please, just once. David felt a slow, simmering rage build in his chest. But he didn't lash out. He exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice even. That's not my choice to make. There was silence. Then, a shaky, I understand. The line went dead. David let the phone fall onto the counter, dragging a hand down his face. He turned, expecting Ethan to still be eating. But he wasn't. The boy stood in the doorway, small and silent, his eyes wide, guarded, filled with too much pain for a child so young were locked onto David. And just like that, David knew. He had heard everything. The question. Ethan didn't speak, didn't ask who had called, didn't need to. David leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. You okay? Ethan nodded once, but it wasn't real. David sighed. Come sit, kid. For once, Ethan did. He pulled himself onto a chair at the kitchen table, posture stiff, eyes fixed on his hands in his lap. David let the silence settle for a moment before he spoke. She wants to see you. Ethan's shoulders tensed, his fingers curled into his sleeves, gripping the fabric tightly. David kept his voice steady. You don't have to decide right now. You don't have to decide at all. But I promised you one thing, and I'm keeping it. Ethan finally looked up. David met his gaze without hesitation. I'm not going anywhere. You're safe here, no matter what you choose. Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His eyes dropped back down to the table, staring at nothing. Then so quiet David almost didn't hear it. She always said she'd make things better. David waited. She never did. A sharp, aching silence settled between them. And then, with quiet finality, Ethan stood up and walked away. Not another word. No tears. No anger. Just a boy too young to carry this weight, but carrying it anyway. David watched him go, watched as Lucky followed. The dog's small body pressed close like a silent guardian. The sound of the bedroom door clicking shut felt heavier than it should have. David rubbed his temples. He had never hated anyone before. But right now, right in this moment, he hated her. Because Ethan deserved so much better. And he was going to make sure he got it. No matter what. The house was quiet. Too quiet. David stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the pile of dishes in the sink. He wasn't thinking about the dishes. He was thinking about Ethan. Ever since the phone call, the boy had retreated into himself again, eating in silence, avoiding eye contact, answering in nods or shrugs instead of words. David had expected anger, maybe even tears, but he hadn't expected nothing. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had seen it before in soldiers who had seen too much. In victims who had been hurt too many times. Shutting down was safer than feeling. But Ethan wasn't a soldier. He was an 8-year-old kid. And he deserved better than silence. David dried his hands, grabbed his keys, and made a decision. The soccer ball. The sun was dipping low when David walked into the backyard. A brand new soccer ball under his arm. Ethan was sitting on the back step, knees pulled to his chest. Lucky curled at his feet. He didn't look up when David approached. David bounced the ball once against the pavement. Ever play soccer? Ethan barely flicked his eyes toward him. Then a small shake of the head. David nodded, as if that answer didn't sting. Wanna learn? A long pause. Then finally, reluctantly, a shrug. David dropped the ball and gave it a gentle kick toward Ethan. It rolled to a stop against his foot. Ethan stared at it. Lucky wagged his tail expectantly. David tilted his head. Go on, kick it back. Ethan hesitated. Then, he lifted his foot and nudged the ball barely a tap. David grinned. You call that a kick? I barely felt it. Ethan's lips pressed together. David kicked the ball back. Just a little harder. Ethan stared at it again. This time, he pulled back his foot and kicked a real kick. The ball shot forward. David caught it with ease. He let out a dramatic gasp. Whoa, kid's got power. You trying to take me out? Ethan blinked. Then so small, so fleeting the corners of his mouth twitched. David acted as if he hadn't seen it. Instead, he kicked the ball again. They played for 20 minutes. David never made it competitive. Never put pressure on Ethan to enjoy it. He just let him be a kid. And by the time the sun set, Ethan was smiling. Not a big smile. Not a loud, happy grin. But it was there. And for the first time in weeks, he laughed. A real, soft, carefree laugh. And David God help him felt something in his chest crack open. Because he would have done anything to hear that sound again. The bedtime routine. Later that night, David went through the usual motions bath for Lucas. Letting Lucky out one last time. Double-checking that the doors were locked. But when he passed Ethan's room, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The bed wasn't empty. Ethan wasn't curled up on the floor like he had been for the past few weeks. He was actually in the bed. David swallowed hard, stepping inside quietly. Lucky was already curled up at Ethan's feet, breathing deeply in sleep. Ethan was awake. He was staring at the ceiling, hands folded over his stomach, the way people did when they were thinking too much. David sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep his voice light. You need anything, kid? Ethan shook his head. David hesitated. Then, deciding to take a leap of faith, he said, you did good today. Ethan turned his head slightly. At what? David shrugged. At being a kid. For a long moment, Ethan didn't say anything. Then quietly, cautiously, it was fun. David felt warmth spread through his chest. Yeah, it was. Ethan hesitated again. Then so small, so unsure he whispered. Are you still mad at her? David's chest tightened. He didn't have to ask who Ethan meant. He exhaled slowly. I don't know if mad is the right word. Ethan turned his head fully now, watching him carefully. David continued, voice steady. I think she hurt you in ways she doesn't even understand. And that's not okay. But more than that, I just don't want you to hurt anymore. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then barely a whisper he asked. Do you think she loved us? David's throat tightened. He didn't want to lie. But he also didn't want to hurt Ethan more than he already had been. So he told the only truth he knew. I think she did, but I don't think she knew how. Ethan's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then softer, like a secret he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. She never came back. David swallowed hard. No, she didn't. Silence. Then finally Ethan whispered, but you did. David's heart clenched. He reached forward, ruffling Ethan's hair the way he had done 100 times before. This time, Ethan didn't pull away. The first real good night. As David stood up, Ethan shifted slightly. David? David turned back. Ethan's fingers curled into his blanket. His voice was small, uncertain. Are we staying? David felt something settle deep in his chest, something solid. He nodded. Yeah, kid, we're staying. Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then so quiet David barely heard it. Good night, Dad. David stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Ethan's face was turned toward the wall now. As if he hadn't meant to say it. As if he wasn't sure if it was allowed. David blinked, swallowed, cleared his throat, and then his voice thick but steady, good night, kid. He turned off the light and closed the door, leaving just the soft glow of the nightlight behind. And for the first time, he knew, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming a family. The autumn wind rustled the golden leaves outside as David poured himself a cup of coffee. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and warm maple syrup, the scent of home. He glanced toward the living room. Lucas sat on the floor, happily babbling to himself as he clumsily stacked toy blocks. Lucky was sprawled beside him, eyes half closed, his tail thumping lazily. And Ethan was at the table, fork in hand, finishing the last few bites of his pancakes. Not in the corner, not on the floor, at the table. David let out a slow breath. It had taken weeks to get here. Small steps, quiet victories. And this? This was one of them. The envelope. David had been carrying it around for days. A simple white envelope, its contents heavier than any stack of paperwork he had ever handled before. He had waited for the right moment. And now as Ethan put down his fork, as Lucky curled up at his feet, as Lucas giggled from across the room, he knew. This was the moment. David reached into his pocket, placed the envelope on the table, and slid it toward Ethan. The boy looked at it, then at David, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. What is it? David exhaled. Something important. Ethan hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out and opened it. His eyes scanned the papers and sighed. His breath hitched. The words at the top were unmistakable. Petition for adoption. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he looked up. His voice so small, so vulnerable cracked on the words. You want to keep us? David felt his chest tighten. I already have. Ethan stared at him. Not with suspicion. Not with fear. With hope. David leaned forward. You don't have to decide right now. But if you want to. If you're ready, I'd like to make this official. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then very carefully, very deliberately he picked up the pen and signed his name. The courthouse. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. A place of laws and judgments. But today for once it wasn't about loss. It was about belonging. Ethan sat next to David, hands folded neatly in his lap. Lucky curled at his feet. Lucas was in David's arms, cooing softly. The judge peered at them over her glasses, a warm smile on her face. Ethan, she said gently, do you want Officer David Carter to be your legal father? The room was silent. Ethan's hands clenched the fabric of his jeans. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate breath. Then with quiet, unwavering certainty, yes. The gavel came down, and just like that it was done. Ethan Carter, Lucas Carter, a family. The first holiday together. Thanksgiving arrived with the scent of roasted turkey, laughter, and the warmth of something Ethan had never truly known before. Home. Friends gathered around the table, David's partner, his colleagues, people who had stepped up and said, "You're not alone." Ethan sat beside David, listening as everyone took turns sharing what they were thankful for. And when the room fell silent, all eyes on him, he hesitated, fidgeted with his fork. Then softer than a whisper he said, I'm thankful for Lucky. David raised an eyebrow, smirking. Just Lucky? Ethan's cheeks flushed. He glanced at David, at Lucas, at the people surrounding him. Then, looking down at his plate, voice barely above a whisper And you? David swallowed the lump in his throat. He reached over and ruffled Ethan's hair, keeping his voice casual for Ethan's sake. Yeah, well, I'm thankful for you too, kid. Ethan didn't pull away, didn't flinch, and for the first time since meeting him he smiled. Without hesitation. The final good night. That night, as David tucked Lucas into bed, he passed by Ethan's room just to check. What he saw made him stop. Ethan was in bed, not curled up in a corner. Not tense, not rigid, not afraid, just asleep. Lucky was at his feet, snoring softly. And for the first time, Ethan looked at peace. David swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. Then, softly, he whispered, "Good night, kid," from the bed, half asleep but somehow still hearing him. "Good night, Dad." David stood frozen. Then quietly, with a smile, he turned off the light and closed the door. They weren't just a family on paper now. They were a family in every way that mattered.